So not much housekeeping to get through this evening, thankfully. I know last week our lessons were quite long, but it was the kind of introduction to the course. But tonight, let's concentrate on our shutters and our apertures. So that's what we're going to be digging into this evening. And these are essential terms in photography, okay? So we're going to be having a look at controlling motion and using our camera's shutter speeds. And then we're going to be diving into how to use our depth of field and how to control this by using our apertures as well. Are you familiar with your shutter speeds and apertures, guys? Are these things areas that cause a little bit of confusion for you? Yeah, new to me, Emma is saying. Some people saying they're familiar with them. Some people, Anthony's saying you're not familiar with them, or perhaps they're causing you confusion. Some people say they're a bit confused by them. Well, that's in a way, that's good to hear, guys, because we're going to demystify all of that for you this evening. And what I really love about this particular lesson is that you're going to be able to take control of your shutter speeds. You're going to be able to take control of your apertures. You're going to be able to apply it to your photography straight away. You're going to see the results straight away after this lesson. So it's one of my favorite lessons on the course. Okay, so we're going to be having a look at how to control these independently first of all. Okay, and then we're going to dive in. These are really the fundamentals, the building blocks for our lessons 7 and 8, are really important lessons 7 and 8, as these bring together how we can control the light and eventually control fully manually our cameras as well. So these are the stepping stones towards our fully manual, and understanding them really is essential to taking full control. And you can have a lot of fun with your shutter speeds and your apertures as well. You can get very, very creative with it. And then as usual, we'll have our summary, a little bit of course interaction with our Q&A at the end of the lesson as well. So are you all ready, guys? Are you all excited? Excellent. Fantastic. Let's do it, John. Indeed, let's do it. Okay, so first of all, why would you want to learn about controlling motion? Well, when you see a subject in motion, if you don't know how to control it, if you don't know how to use your shutter speeds, your camera is going to make the decisions for you. And your camera can't make a decision as to whether to freeze a subject in motion or to blur them. So if you've ever tried to do a photograph like this of a waterfall, where you might want to have the fluid motion through the water like this to make it look silky like we can see in this photograph here, or if you want to freeze the motion, if you want to try and capture and get all the water nice and sharp, if you don't know how to control the motion by using your shutter speed, your camera is going to give you inconsistent results. So developing your knowledge of shutter speed will allow you to achieve these types of photographs. And I can see lots of people saying, the left waterfall is beautiful, Wian is saying. Yeah, it's a very popular type of photograph to try and take. Okay, Isabel, you're mentioning an ND filter. We'll speak about those in the Q&A session as well, Isabel. But let's, for the moment, just think about our shutter speeds. And then we've also got our apertures and our depth of field. And apertures and depth of field really relate to things like our portraiture and our landscape photography. So I'm sure lots of us who practice portraiture want to try and get nice, blurry, soft backgrounds, and without being able to control our apertures, our cameras are always going to make an inconsistent decision about what aperture, what depth of field should be used in our photographs. And this could be the opposite then if we're trying to photograph a landscape where we want everything nice and sharp throughout the entire photograph, but our camera keeps picking a shallow depth of field instead, so the mountains in the background are not as sharp as they could be. So taking control of our apertures and our shutter speeds are going to allow us to help fulfill our creative vision. Okay, so let's get right into it. So we're going to have a look at shutter speeds first of all. We'll break everything down on shutter speeds, and then later on we'll have a look at our camera's apertures as well. So in the previous lesson, in lesson 3, some of you may have seen this already with Thomas Woods. If you haven't, don't worry. You will be, as I said, you'll be able to catch up on this. But in lesson 3, we looked at the camera obscura. And the camera obscura is a device that allows light to enter through a hole into a box or into a room even as well. So the light enters through this little hole, and what it did, it projected the outside onto the inside. And this was a device that was used by mathematicians. It was a device that was used by painters as well, to be able to accurately reproduce the outside. But the problem with this was it was quite slow. You know, the painter would take days to paint it, to trace it, and that. But when light-sensitive material replaced the painter or artist, they were able to begin to record images. But they needed a means of stopping the light when the image was exposed properly. So if too much light entered the image, it would mean that we'd get an overexposed image where everything would just be white. So remember, too much light and the image becomes too bright, washed out, and the whites become pure white. We have no detail in the photograph. Initially, these light-sensitive materials were not very sensitive to light, and an exposure time could take minutes, not like today's film and sensors where light can be captured in fractions of a second. So in those days, all they had to do was put something like a lens cap over the hole or lens to prevent any more light from entering in the camera. And I was watching, there was a movie on there the other day, Mr. Turner. You might be familiar with it. It's about that famous painter, that famous English painter. And there's a scene in it, he was a Victorian painter, but there's a scene in it where he's getting his photograph taken by a photographer. And that's all the photographer does when he wants to finish the exposure. He puts the lens cap back onto the camera. But today it's a little bit different. As the camera developed and the materials became much more light sensitive, they needed a faster mechanism to stop the light. So a mechanical shutter was developed. And essentially this is like a curtain that dropped down to cover the light sensitive material from receiving any more light and thus preventing the image from exposing further. So this is known as a focal plane shutter. It's the most common type of photographic shutter. There are other types, but we'll just concentrate on a focal plane shutter. This is the one that we'll find in the majority of cameras, if you're using a mirrorless camera, if you're using a DSLR, and so on. And it's positioned immediately in front of the camera's sensor or in front of the camera's film. There are some other types of shutter, but we'll just focus on the focal plane shutter for the moment. It's typically what we find in our digital cameras today. In traditional film cameras or analog cameras, these worked by mechanics connected to our shutter button. So we pressed our shutter button on top of the camera to capture a picture, and a series of mechanical parts, gears and springs would move the shutter out of the way and allow the light sensitive film to receive the light for the length of time that we set on the top of the camera. So you can see we set the time by changing the shutter speed dial. So we pressed the shutter button, the focal plane shutter opened up for the duration of time that we selected on the top of the camera. Is everybody with me so far? Quite basic, but just so that we understand how the shutter speed works. Brilliant. Excellent. So here is another view of the focal plane shutter inside the camera. Okay, so if you have an old film camera, you might have seen this before. So this black mechanism that you can see here, this is our focal plane shutter. So when we press the shutter button down, this moves upwards out of the way and allows light to travel past and reach the piece of film so that the image can begin to form, our camera sensor. Then it drops back down and it prevents any further light from reaching the camera sensor or the film, thus exposing it anymore. So here you can see in the second image that the piece of film sits in the back of the camera and the shutter, the focal plane shutter, is just in front of it, blocking any light from getting to it. So this works exactly the same in a digital camera. However, the connection between the shutter button and the focal plane shutter is now electronic. So there's no mechanical parts that are opening and closing the shutter. It's all just done digitally. It's all just done by the camera's brain. It sends a message to the shutter about how long it is to stay open. So here we can see a view of it here. We can see that the digital camera, the sensor is being exposed. The focal plane shutter has moved out of the way to allow the camera sensor to be exposed. So when I looked at a DSLR in the first lesson, we saw that light enters in the lens. It gets redirected upwards out and through the pentaprism, and it comes out the viewfinder, allowing you to see. Does everybody remember that from lesson 1 we broke down how our DSLRs worked? Specifically, we broke down what a DSLR meant. Excellent. Excellent. James, Emma, Julie, they all remember from that lesson. But when you press the shutter button all the way down, the light enters the lens, the mirror moves upwards out of the way and gets to the sensor to record the image. However, what I didn't mention at that time is that behind the mirror sits the shutter, the focal plane shutter, and this also prevents light from getting to the sensor. So just located in front of the sensor, so between the mirror and in front of the sensor is our focal plane shutter, is our shutter position. So when we press the shutter release button, in actual fact, when the mirror moves out of the way, at the same time the shutter is moving out of the way as well to allow the light to enter through and to hit the back of the camera to create our photograph. So for different lighting situations, with our shutter speeds, you have different options. So the camera's shutter, just to kind of summarize it, the camera's shutter controls the duration of light, that the duration of time that the light is entering into the camera, exposing the sensor. Okay, the length of time that the shutter is open is known as the shutter speed. If we need more light, the shutter is going to be open for a longer duration. So if we need more light, if our photograph is too dark, we might need to increase the shutter speed, make the shutter speed longer so that more light enters in. If we need less light, if the photograph is too bright, we want the shutter to be open for a shorter duration. So does everybody follow that so far? Just waiting for a few yeses to come in there. There we go. Vincent, Sean, fantastic. Brilliant, great stuff. So that is our shutter speeds in a nutshell. Shutter speed, simplified, basically controls the length of time that the shutter is open, and this is known as our shutter speed. So shutter speeds are measured in seconds and fractions of a second. So we're going to deal with seconds and fractions of a second, but it is actually possible to set them for minutes long as well if we need to. We'll speak about that a little bit later on. But for the moment, mainly we are going to be dealing in fractions of a second. So here's some of the common shutter speeds that are available to us. Now, you might see more shutter speeds on your own cameras, okay, but these are what we'd call the common shutter speeds. These are the ones that we should get most familiar with as photographers, and there's a very particular reason for that we'll have a look at in a later lesson. So these are fractions of a second. So if we have a look here, like at a 1/2000 of a second, this is a fraction of a second. Now, even though the number is larger than these slower numbers, this is far, far faster than, say, 1/8 of a second, a fraction of a second. If you think about it, a 2,000 of a second, that's incredibly fast. That's actually faster than we blink. So the higher the number, the faster the shutter opens and closes, and the less light that gets into the camera. Shutter speeds on this end of the scale are incredibly fast. So just try to imagine that, guys, at 2,000 of a second or 4,000 of a second. Just imagine how fast that is. As I said, that's faster than we can blink. And if you were to look at the shutter in motion at these speeds, you probably wouldn't even see it move because it all happens so fast. So light is entering the camera for a fraction of a second. The lower the number, the slower the shutter opens and closes. So light enters the camera for a much longer period of time. So a 1/4 of a second or an 1/8 of a second. All these shutter speeds down at this end of the scale are considered slow shutter speeds. Now that still might seem extremely fast to you, but in terms of light, that's a long duration for the shutter to be open. So as I mentioned, the list above here are some of the common shutter speeds found on cameras. Shutter speeds are standardized across all cameras, so will always be the same. But you may see some more figures, some more shutter speeds on your own cameras as well. But you will definitely see all of these shutter speeds on your cameras too. So let's have a look at this a little bit more in depth. Shutter speeds are expressed as a fraction of a second. Now they might appear on your camera like this, simply as a number like 248, 15th, 30th, 60th, and so on. So they just appear like that on your camera as fractions. If you are doing an exposure that's a couple of seconds long, generally they will appear with these little inverted commas beside them. How many of you have seen this on your cameras before when you're setting your shutter speed, if you've experimented with your shutter speed before, that you can see these little inverted commas on it? If you see that beside the number, that means it's a second. Okay, so it's going into your seconds. So we've got 1 second, 2 seconds, 4 seconds, all the way up to 30 seconds. A lot of cameras will go to shutter speeds as slow as 30 seconds. Beyond this, there is usually what's called a bulb mode. And bulb mode, sometimes it's just shown as B on the camera. But this allows you to manually control the timing of the shutter. So in other words, say you need a shutter speed of around a minute or 4 minutes and so on. You would set your camera to the bulb mode and you have to hold the shutter button down for 4 minutes. So you will open the shutter yourself and then you decide when you want to close the shutter. Now, in this particular case, you would generally use what's called a cable release as well. You'd have what's called a cable release or perhaps a wireless remote as well, so you can simply hold the shutter button down at ease in that particular case. So if you ever see the bulb mode on your cameras, that's what that means, is you're manually setting your shutter speed. So you can set it for as long or as short as you like, and that'd probably be very, very good for very long exposures. Amanda, you're just asking, so would that be the best setting for astrophotography? It depends on what you want to get, Amanda. If you want a long exposure for astrophotography where you get the star trails, you would use the bulb mode for that. But you can also get very short exposures for astrophotography as well. A little bit complicated astrophotography. We might speak about that a little bit later on. But we'll have a look at some examples as well, Amanda, too, a little bit later. So is everybody still with me so far? Excellent. Lots of people saying they now understand what the bulb mode. Yeah, the bulb mode can be a source of confusion for photographers just starting out or beginning. It's a really good mode, and we'll have a look at why you might use it a little bit later on as well. So, as I mentioned, on your camera, you will see the shutter speed either as a fraction or just a number written down on its own. So shutter speeds, they can be displayed at the top of your camera, if you have a top LCD like the camera here, or perhaps they might just be shown on the back, on the LCD on the back, and indeed you'll also see them in the viewfinder as well. So if you weren't familiar with your shutter speeds before, you should be able to locate them on your cameras as well. If you still cannot find it on your cameras, I see a couple of people saying they can't, do refer to your camera's manual and it should indicate to you where your camera's shutter speed is. It's a fundamental part of how your camera works, so you should have it in some capacity on your camera. Okay, you'll be able to find it somewhere, but generally it's going to be displayed on the back of the screen. Someone's just asking there, what is the 5.6 there? Well, we're going to have a look at that later on in the lesson. Okay, that's our camera's apertures, but we'll have a look at that later in the lesson. Now, I want to ask you guys a question. Why would we want to change our shutter speeds? Why do we want to change our shutter speeds? As we have just discussed, shutter speeds control the duration of light that the light enters the camera and exposes your image. But it has a secondary function. Does anybody want to tell me what that secondary function is? Mark is spot on. Christo is spot on as well. Sue, you're saying action. Yeah, you're definitely along the right lines there. Donnie, you've got the answer absolutely spot on as well. Yes, Annette, you're totally spot on. Just waiting for some more answers to come in there. Karen, you're saying speed. Yeah, Karen, you're absolutely wrong. You're absolutely along the right idea as well. We want to change our shutter speeds to control motion in our photographs, movement or motion in our photographs. So if you said speed, if you said action or motion or movement, you're definitely correct. Okay, so shutter speed, as well as controlling the amount of light that enters into our camera, it also controls the motion in our images, or essentially how motion or movement is captured in our photographs. Shutter speeds determine whether the motion is frozen in the images or if it's allowed to flow to create a nice kind of movement or blur. Having control over motion in your images gives you new creative capabilities that you might not have had before, and it'll certainly allow you to make much more interesting photographs. So how does shutter speed control motion? Well, let's have a look at this. So here we've got an example of a moving motorcycle that has been captured and frozen in motion. So essentially, when you use really fast shutter speeds, the subject, whether moving or stationary, won't have much time to move any distance for the duration that the shutter is open. So this image here was captured at 500th of a second. So if we bring up my common shutter speeds here, we can see that this photograph was captured at 500th of a second. And what has happened is that the motorcycle didn't move any great distance in that time, and therefore it gets captured as frozen or as stationary. So this should make a little bit more sense in the next slide when we see what happens when we use a slower shutter speed. So Phoebe, you're asking, how do you freeze? Well, you use a fast shutter speed, Phoebe. So anything from maybe 250th of a second all the way up to 4,000 or 8,000th of a second is going to be very, very, very fast. And that's going to capture or freeze motion in your photographs. So here we have the same motorcycle again, and this is captured at a much slower shutter speed. This is captured at a 30th of a second. Okay, so we're going much, much slower now in this particular photograph. And as you can see here, the motorcycle blurs through the scene as it's no longer captured as frozen. So what's happened here to cause it to blur? Well, it's very, very simple. In the 30th of a second that the shutter was opened, the motorcycle has had time to move slightly through the scene. So to really give you a sense of this, of how this works, let's just focus on the headlamp here. Okay, so if we have a look at the headlamp on the motorcycle, when the exposure was started, the red arrow here indicates the position of where the headlamp was. Then this green arrow indicates the position of the headlamp when the shutter was closed again. So, in the space of time that the shutter was opened for the motorcycle to move from the red arrow to the green arrow, in that 30th of a second, it moved through the scene, and this creates the blur. So does that make sense? So that movement is captured because the motorcycle is moving quite fast, and when the shutter opens, it captured the motorcycle in one position, but by the time it closed, the motorcycle had moved to a new position. Therefore, we get this blur. Now, very, very often, students email me and they ask me why am I getting blurry photographs, and they wonder, is it a reason to do with their focus? But most of the time, it's actually to do with their shutter speeds. So you'll see this quite often if you photograph indoors or at night. Has this ever happened to you where you get blurry photographs when you photograph indoors or at night? If it's happened to you, quite often it's much more to do with your shutter speed rather than doing with your camera's focusing. So you do want to pay attention to your shutter speeds, especially if you're indoors. And this is an area for photographers where they can often get caught out. Because I know when you're indoors, you might think that there's enough light available to you, but what your camera sees is actually a lot less light. Okay, so pay attention to that. Try and maintain a shutter speed of about a 30th to a 60th of a second if you're indoors. If not, if you can get it faster, that's even better. Okay, so let's see how this applies to going back to our waterfalls. So here we have two examples of how you can control motion in your image. The first photograph is captured at about a 30th of a second, maybe a slight exaggeration here, but just to give you the idea of this, of about a 30th of a second, to give the water time to flow through the scene and to create a sense of movement and get this nice, silky, smooth effect of the water. The second image is shot at a much higher shutter speed, a much faster shutter speed. And like we discussed before, in this short space of time, the water doesn't have much time to move through and it gets recorded as frozen or as static. So you can see that the water is much sharper in that second photograph. So if you want to try and capture everything and freeze it using a very fast shutter speed is the way to go. This is a really good example of how controlling shutter speed gives you two creative decisions when making pictures. If you're faced with a scene like this, now you have a choice to blur the motion, like with a slow shutter speed, like with the image here on the left, or you might decide, do you want to use a very fast shutter speed to try and freeze the motion? And it opens up new possibilities for your photographs. So this is two new possibilities for your pictures now, guys. So, you can go out there and you can start playing with your shutter speeds and see what you can get. So let's have a look at some examples, some other scenarios that you might use fast or slow shutter speeds. So here we have a classic example of freezing the subject. And, we often get photographs of motocross and, car racing and so on. So these are definitely examples that you may want to freeze the motion by using a fast shutter speed. This kind of shot would need a shutter speed somewhere between 500th of a second, possibly up to 2000th of a second. There's not any rules as such. It really depends on how fast the subject is moving and how static or how frozen you want them to appear in the photograph. You might also use fast shutter speeds for this type of photography. We looked at something like this in lesson 1. This is another nice example of freezing someone mid-action. This is a wonderful way to see a scene in detail that would happen too fast in reality for us to enjoy in the same way. And again, surfing is a very fast sport. So I'd say the shutter speed here well above 500th of a second. Now obviously for something like this you're also going to want to have a waterproof casing for your camera or something like that as well to make sure that your camera doesn't get ruined. Quite often photographers, if you ever watch surfing photographers, they're in the water capturing these amazing photographs as well. Slow shutter speeds can make normal scenes look a lot more interesting as well. So moving away from the fast shutter speeds and looking at the slower shutter speeds, it can create a great sense of motion and movement, and it can be used to make a scene more visually interesting. So for example, this busy public space with lots of movement. Imagine if this photograph is captured with a fast shutter speed. All the people will be frozen and static, and it may not convey the same sense of motion and business that we get from a shot like this. So if you imagine if you're out on your high street, your local high street, and you're photographing all the shoppers going in and out of the shops, you might find that if you actually use a slower shutter speed, it conveys a sense of busyness, it conveys a sense of movement and motion. So this would be a shutter speed, even about, Herman's just asking, what shutter speed is this? About a 30th of a second, maybe even a little bit slower than that, Herman. And you would get the movement like this. As you can see here, there's still a little bit of frozen, a little bit of static here in the people's feet. So it's not too slow. You'd still get away with a handheld shot at about a 30th of a second. But you can see how you can get creative with your shutter speeds, how you can convey a message through your fast or your slow shutter speeds. And indeed, again, another way to a slow shutter speed can give a strong sense of motion. In this shot, this is taken from the front of a moving car. And rather than the environment moving, in this shot, it's the camera that's moving through the scene and creates a sense of blur. So the camera would be sitting on the dashboard, and because the car is moving through the scene, we have a slightly slower shutter speed, and we get this incredible movement, as we can see, like we're moving through. It really gives a sense that we're traveling through this environment rather than just a static shot of a road. Okay, and a very, very popular area for slow shutter speeds. This is a really fun way to experiment with slower shutter speeds, is nighttime photography. So how many of you would like to make a photograph like this? Lizelle, you're saying it's amazing what you can do with your camera. Absolutely, Lizelle. That's what I love about photography, is when you apply your slow shutter speeds, or when we look at our apertures later on, the instant results that you get from it, that you can see straight away the difference, okay? Now, don't worry, we will have a look at how you can control your shutter speed in just a moment as well. But this is a really fun way to create nighttime photographs. This image is captured from a bridge above a motorway. And in a shot like this, the exposure time would be much longer. You'd be looking at about 30 seconds or so. So something like that, a 30-second exposure would allow the cars to pass through the scene, okay? And because the cars are moving quite fast, they don't get recorded in the photograph, but their lights are so bright that we get this movement captured, okay? So Stuart's just saying, would you need a tripod for this? Absolutely, for sure. You're definitely going to need a tripod for this, and we'll speak about those in just a moment as well. This photograph is the same idea. We have a train passing through a tunnel here, but because the train is moving fast, but the lights are so much brighter on the train, only the lights of the train get registered in the exposure, and we get this movement through the shot. If the train had stopped or was moving much slower through the scene, it would have also been recorded or registered in the exposure as well. It's all about the speed of the object and the length of the exposure as well. Remember, most cameras will go down to about a 30-second exposure, but if you need any longer than that, you're going to select your bulb mode as well, where you'll need to manually decide how long the shutter is open and closed. And I forget, was it Angelique was asking earlier on, my apologies if that's incorrect, but you were asking about astrophotography as well, and what shutter speeds you might use for astrophotography. Well, here's an exposure that could be hours long. So this could be hours long. And the shutter has been open for so long that we can see the stars are streaking through the sky. Now, does anybody want to tell me why are they moving in a circular motion instead of straight across the sky? So why did the stars appear as a circle rather than straight across the sky? Mario, yeah, you're absolutely spot on. Mike, yeah, you're spot on. Barbara, you're right as well. Graham. Mary, Maurice, yeah, absolutely, everybody's getting it there. It's because of the rotation of the Earth. So the Earth moves around the sun, it moves around in a circle as well, and that's why we get this movement, this rotation in the stars. It's because of the Earth spinning, Cecil, absolutely. So that's why the stars don't move straight across the sky. So something like this, you would need a very, very long exposure, perhaps a couple of hours to create that movement, to capture that Earth's rotation. So I've spoken a lot. We've looked at some examples as well of how you might use your shutter speed, but how do you actually change it? How do you actually control your shutter speed? Well, let's have a look at that. So we looked at this very, very briefly in lesson 2 when we were breaking down some of the modes on our cameras. We spoke about our shutter priority mode, and we spoke about our time value mode as well. So your camera gives you the ability to control motion in your images through a semi-manual function called shutter priority or time value mode. So it might appear as S, it might appear as TV, it might appear as SP, whatever way it appears on your camera, it all does the same thing. It controls your shutter speed. It's a semi-manual mode. So what do I mean by semi-manual mode? Well, basically, this function allows you to take control over your camera's shutter speed and make decisions about whether you want a long exposure or a short exposure in your images. What the camera does, it gives you the ability to change your shutter speeds, and it does all the other work for you. It does all the other work for you. So you don't have to worry about your apertures, your ISOs and so on. So it'll make sure that when you change your shutter speed, that all the other functions of the camera work so that you get a good exposure, so that your photograph's hopefully not going to be too overexposed or too underexposed. This is a fantastic stepping stone before you take the leap into full control of your camera. So getting familiar with this mode, I strongly recommend after this lesson you play around with your time value, your shutter priority mode, also your aperture priority mode. We'll look at that in a moment as well. So this is a function I really urge you to take advantage of if your camera has it. It will allow you to get your head around controlling motion in your images and give you some new creative control. Remember, when you learn how to control motion, you can now decide, do I want to freeze the subject or do I want to allow the subject to blur and flow through the scene? And this means you've got two new choices when making photographs. So once you switch to the time value mode or shutter priority mode, you'll be in control of the shutter speed setting. And you will need to know how to change this setting. Now this will be camera specific, and you'll have to check your camera's manual to be sure on this. But it should have a section on time value or shutter priority mode that will definitely show you the dial for changing your shutter speed. And usually it's the dial on the front of the camera, this little guy here. You just simply change that to the left and right, and you should be able to see the shutter speed change when you've got your time value or your shutter priority selected. Does everybody understand that so far? Okay, just waiting for a few yeses to come in there. So it's a little bit slow at my end. Excellent. There's all the yeses coming in there now. Fantastic. So usually shutter speeds are changeable from the main dial on the front of the camera, or perhaps you might have a quick control dial at the back. Saying that, they can also be changeable from a button, but it all completely depends on your own camera. So do check your camera's manual for the correct instruction. Okay, so you will definitely need to be able to change your shutter speeds as your photography progresses towards fully manual. So we urge you to get used to that mode after this lesson. Now, we mentioned these a little bit earlier on as well. When it comes to using shutter speeds, it's important to know about camera shake. And we spoke about this when you're photographing indoors. Camera shake comes from using shutter speed slow enough that you moving will cause the camera to blur. So it's actually your vibrations, even though you might feel that you're standing as still as possible, perfectly still, you still might pick up micro vibrations, and this causes camera blur with slower shutter speeds. So as we have seen, if shutter speeds are slow, objects passing through the scene can be blurred. However, you'll be the one introducing a blur into the scene by moving the camera during slow shutter speeds. And because you move the camera, the whole scene blurs. So have camera shake in them. So photographs that have a little bit of camera shake, a little bit blurriness on them, it's generally because of slower shutter speeds, and they have that unsharp look about them. So you do want to try and keep your shutter speeds high if you're hand holding the camera. For me, I don't tend to go slower than a 60th of a second, but it absolutely depends on you. There's no set rule. But a 60th of a second generally is as slow as I'll go hand holding the photograph or for holding the camera. Now, if you have vibration reduction, image stabilizer and so on in the camera, you might get away with slightly slower shutter speeds as well. These help to increase your shutter speed without introducing camera shake. But the best way you can go around reducing any blur in your photographs is to use a tripod. Tripods are by far the best way of reducing any camera shake. Now, obviously, you can't use them in every single situation that you're photographing, but if you are doing landscape photography and the light is a little bit less, you can use a tripod. And indeed, if you're doing nighttime photography, really they are essential. So when it comes to tripods, I do recommend investing a little bit of money into them if possible and avoid going for the plastic ones. Try and get a metal one if you can because they'll last you much longer. Gorilla Pods, tabletop tripods and so on, they're great little tripods to be using if you're traveling as well. So if you don't want to use a really big tripod and if you travel a lot, you might get one of those little tripods that you can see here over on the right hand side. And they're universal as well, so they'll fit any single camera at all. Now, so that's our shutter speeds. Switch your camera to your S mode or your TV mode and start taking control of the motion in your photographs. So that's everything to do with our shutter speeds for the moment. But let's move on to our camera's apertures. Let's have a look at the other fundamental function on our cameras, and that is the camera's aperture. So the aperture in our cameras is, well, it functions very similarly to our eyes, which we'll see in just a moment. The aperture is located in your camera's lens. It's not located in your camera's body. Okay, so it's located in your camera's lens, and it's the mechanism for controlling how much light or the volume of light that's coming into your photographs, that's coming in through the lens. So the distinction between your shutter and your aperture is this. The shutter speed controls how long the light gets into the camera for, whereas the aperture controls how much light gets into the camera or the volume of light that's coming into the photograph. So shutter speed equals time and aperture equals volume. Okay, so let's break this down. Let's understand our apertures a little bit more. The aperture in your lenses works exactly the same way as your pupil in your eye does, as it can be made bigger to allow more light in, or it can be closed down to let less light in. Let me ask you a question. What happens to our eyes when we go somewhere dark? So if we walk into a room, it's very bright outside, but we've walked into a dark room, what does our eyeball do? Absolutely, yeah, Karen, you're absolutely right. Alison, you're absolutely right. Sharon, you're spot on as well. Yeah, everybody's getting it there. Our pupils dilate, or they open up. They open up, they become bigger to allow more light in. When we go back out into the bright sunlight, our pupils get smaller, so they restrict the amount of light coming in. Our camera's apertures work in the exact same way. The aperture opens up wide to let more light in if we need more light, but it also closes down very small if we need less light, if there's too much light coming into the scene. So here we can see a view inside the lens of the aperture, and as you can see, the size of the aperture can change or it can be adjusted. If we need more light, it becomes bigger. If we need less light, it becomes smaller. So this is to allow more or less light into the camera depending on the situation. Okay, so to give you a sense of how the apertures mechanically work, this image here has a closer view, and we have what are called our aperture blades within our camera's lenses. So these blades, these slide over each other to allow it to get bigger or smaller. So if you've ever seen a James Bond film, I'm sure we've all seen a James Bond film at some stage, at the start when he's walking along, and it's like the gun is following him. Well, it actually looks like an aperture instead. So it's not necessarily a gun that's following him, but it might actually be a camera instead, somebody trying to photograph him. But that's where we would see, you might be familiar with seeing those aperture blades before. But they're located in our camera's lenses, and they slide over each other to make that little hole bigger or smaller. So apertures are expressed as f-stops or f-numbers. So I know a lot of people have asked me about that. What's an f-stop? Why am I seeing an F on my lens? Well, apertures are expressed as f-stops or f-numbers. Okay? Each lens will have a certain range of standard aperture sizes. So not all lenses are created equally, unfortunately. Some lenses will have more apertures available to them than other lenses will. So you can find your apertures, your f numbers on your lens, but you'll also find them in your camera's body as well. We'll have a look at that in a moment. Arpana is just asking, where can I find my f numbers? Well, if you have a look at your camera's lens, you might see something. If you're using an 18 to 55 millimeter lens, for example, you might see something that says 1 to 3.5 to 5.6. So basically what that means is your widest aperture is 3.5 when you're at 18 millimeters, or closes down to 5.6 when you're at 55 millimeters. That'll make a little bit more sense in just a moment. Okay, but let's have a look at our common apertures. Okay, so this is an illustration of our common f-stops, or our f numbers. And I want you to get used to using that term f-stops. So, so you can practice your photographic vocabulary. And as you can see, they're all expressed with that F in front of them. And that F stands for focal, just in case you're wondering what it means. Well, we refer to it as focal. It's a little bit more complicated by that. So the thing that usually confuses people at the beginning is that the larger the number, the smaller the f-stop, or the hole that allows the light in. Essentially, the larger the number, the smaller the hole is, and the less light that's passing through. So apertures can be a little bit more complicated than our shutter speeds. So I want you to get used to this idea. When the number is very low or small like this, more light is coming in. As you can see, you know, at f1.4, the hole is much larger. That means much more light is coming in. But when we go up to f22, there's far less light coming in. The hole is much smaller. Okay? So to find the f-stops on your own cameras, well, they usually appear next to the camera's shutter speed. Okay, so we had a look at where the shutter speed was on a little bit earlier. So beside it, and Leanne, you were asking where is what is the f number? That is your aperture. So apertures or f-stops usually appear next to the shutter speeds on your camera. On more manual cameras, if you have an older film camera, the apertures actually appear on the actual lens as well. And they're changed by turning a barrel on the lens. But for the majority of DSLRs nowadays, they are located, you'll see them actually on the camera's LCD. But some older cameras, you might actually find the aperture on the lens as well. So is everybody with me so far? So apertures are expressed as f-stops, or f numbers. The smaller the number, the wider the aperture, meaning more light comes in. The higher the number, the smaller the aperture, meaning less light comes in. It takes a little bit of getting used to with our apertures, but the best way to get used to them is to practice it. So I asked you a little bit earlier on, why would we change our shutter speeds? But now I'm going to ask you a question. Why do we want to change our apertures? Why would we want to change our apertures? So as we saw, the aperture can help us control the flow or the volume of light entering the lens. But just like our shutter speeds, it has a secondary function as well. Why would we want to change the aperture rather than the shutter in terms of trying to control the amount of light coming into the sensor? Okay, so just waiting for a couple of answers to come in there now. Excellent, I can see Graham has got it there, Ian has got it there. Fantastic. David, you've got it there as well. Absolutely right, guys. So the aperture, its secondary function is depth of field. It allows you to control the depth of field in our photographs. And depth of field refers to how much how much of your scene is in focus from the foreground to the background. So why would you want different areas of your scene to be in focus? Well, you may want to blur out objects in the background of your image by opening up that aperture wide, so that will reduce the depth of field in your scene. Or perhaps you may want all the elements of your scene to be in focus, so by choosing an aperture of f16 or f22, this will deepen your depth of field, meaning that more of the scene is going to be in focus from the foreground to the background. Depth of field is another compositional tool to help the viewer understand what the subject of your image is. Depth of field can be used to guide the viewer's eye or the viewer's attention and help emphasize the subject in your image. So in images with a shallow depth of field, the background becomes blurred out and the eye is drawn to the object in focus. And this is most commonly used in portraiture. So in landscape scenes, generally the entire landscape is the subject you want, and so the entire scene generally is in focus. So aperture is the key to controlling the depth of field in your photograph. So let's have a look at some examples of this just to understand depth of field a little bit more. So this is an example of an image with what we would call a shallow depth of field. Shallow depth of field is where a small area of your image is in focus and the rest is blurred out. So in this case, the subject or person in the foreground is in focus and sharp, as we can see quite clearly here, but the background is soft, it's out of focus. You know, and this style of photography is most commonly used, or is the most common use of shallow depth of field. This particular image was shot with an aperture, a wide aperture of f2.8. Remember, the smaller the number, the smaller the f-stop, the larger the hole, meaning the shallower the depth of field. Okay, the opposite is, this is the opposite use. This is where we would take a photograph of a landscape and what we would call a deep depth of field, or also a tight aperture. This is where everything in the scene from the foreground to the background is sharp and in focus. And this image here is captured with an f-stop or an f number of f22. And this is very popular in landscape photography when the photographer wants to make sure that everything from the lake in the foreground to those mountains all the way in the background are nice and clear and sharp as well. Okay, so we would use a higher f-stop number here, meaning that less light is coming in, but it also means that our photograph is going to have a deeper depth of field. So depth of field is the measure of how much of the scene is in focus from the foreground to the furthest object in the background. So in this image here, the photographer has focused on the subject, this construction worker, and he's using an aperture of, say, f5.6 or f8, what we'd call a mid-range aperture, which, you know, it's a fairly standard aperture. So he's captured an image with a shallow depth of field. And it's pretty obvious that the person in the picture is in focus and that the background is out of focus. But let's have a look at how much of the scene is in focus. So if we look at this in detail, the image is sharp from the ground right in the front of the picture back to about a couple of feet behind the subject. So in this case, the depth of field extends from about 2 meters in front of the scene towards the background. Anything from that point backwards beyond is out of focus. Depth of field is like an area in your image that is in focus. Anything with that within that area is going to be in focus as well. So we'll take this a little bit further in the next few examples by looking at a side view of a photo shoot. So Monica, you're saying this is what I'm most confused on. Well, let's have a look at some other examples. I think this next example will help you to put it together a little bit more. So here we have a side view of a photographer with some really ridiculous shoes. Very, very pointy shoes. But anyway, a side view of a photographer. And as we can see, he's capturing people at different distances from him. So for the very first shot, the camera is set at f2.8 and he's focusing on the gentleman here in the front with the briefcase. Okay, so when he focuses on the person closest to him and he takes the picture at f2.8, because this is a very wide aperture, it means we have a very shallow depth of field, and this means the person closest to him is going to be in focus, but everybody behind him is going to be out of focus. Now, if there was any other person or object within the space represented by the red arrow here, they would also be in focus. Let's say we close the aperture down a little bit. We make it a little bit tighter. and we can see what happens here. So if he wants to get the next person in focus, and he's still focusing on the person in the front, he will close the aperture down. This extends the depth of field and means the person in the second here will also become in focus as well. So we're still focusing on the person in the front, but by closing the aperture down, it brings the person, we're increasing the depth of field, and it brings that second person here in the red in focus as well. We'll close it down to 5.6. We'll make that aperture a little bit tighter as well. So to advance this on and bring another person into focus, he needs to close the aperture down another size. So the next aperture he will use is f5.6. Now don't worry if you're unfamiliar with the different aperture numbers. Eventually these will become a part of your photographic vocabulary. But changing the aperture down to 5.6 brings another person into focus. Does everybody understand that so far? And I'm sure you can see what's happening. You know, every time we close the aperture down, if we're to close it down to f8, again, the next person becomes in focus as well. And we might just add another person on now as well. We're going down to f11. We're closing the aperture down even tighter. We're making the aperture smaller. And as we make the aperture smaller, it increases the depth of field, meaning more of the scene is in focus. We could go all the way down to f16, and every single person now in this row is now in focus. So that's focusing on the person in the front with the briefcase and simply closing the aperture down along the way, and that brings everybody else in focus. But perhaps maybe I only want one person in focus in the middle and I want a shallow depth of field around them. Well, how can I do that? Well, let's have a look at how to do that. So depth of field extends around the subject or the object that you focus on. So if you focus on a subject, say halfway into your image, that object will be in focus. And if you are using a shallow depth of field, such as f2.8 in this case, everything in front of and behind the subject will be out of focus. So let's have a look at what I mean by that. So if I decide to focus on the guy in red instead, okay, if I focus on him instead, but I still use a shallow depth of field, a depth of field of 2.8, it means that he will be in focus, but everything in front of him and everything behind him is going to be soft and out of focus. So if you want to get that type of effect where everything in the foreground and the background is out of focus, you simply choose something in the middle of the photograph to focus on instead. And you use a shallow depth of field, and that means everything will be soft in the front and in the background. Now, Monica, you're saying your lens doesn't have an aperture of f2.8. Not every lens is going to have it, Monica. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but you will have to check your own lenses to see what apertures are available to you. Okay, so let's just have a look. If we were to move on and we were to have a focus on the woman in the center here, and again, we use an aperture of f2.8. Again, everybody in front of her and behind her is going to be in a shallow depth of field. They're not going to be in focus, and so on as we move on throughout the scene. If we focus on this guy a little bit further in the back and we use a shallow depth of field, again, everybody in front of him and behind him will be out of focus. So to give you a kind of a more straight on view of what that might look like, you can see it a lot more clearly here. So as you can see in this example, that if we focus on the person who's second person in this line with a shallow depth of field, everything in front and behind her will be out of focus. So we focus on this lady here and we use a shallow depth of field, a wide depth of field, and everything in front of her and behind her is going to be out of focus. So we'd probably use an aperture of, say, f2.8 in this particular case. Now, just a quick note on depth of field. Don't worry if this subject is new to you and you're not too sure about this. yet, but if you are familiar with your depth of field and apertures a little bit already, I just want to mention one thing. Depth of field extends from about 1/3 on front of the subject and about 2/3 behind the subject you are focused on. So I'll just repeat that. Depth of field extends from about 1/3 on front of your subject and about 2/3 behind the subject that you are focused on. So when you focus on a subject, a small area in front of them will be in focus as well as a larger area behind them. How big that area is depends on what aperture you use. So it's 1/3 in front of the subject and about 2/3 behind the subject that will be sharp. Now, so we're nearly at the end of the lesson, guys. I know we're on the hour. We've only got just a couple of more slides to have a look at, and we'll get on to our Q&A then. So just if you can hang on for about 5 minutes, just while we complete the lesson, and then you can head off, or you can hang on for the Q&A. So is everybody still with me just before I go any further, just to make sure we're still on the same page? Excellent, excellent. So we had a look earlier at how to control our shutter speeds. So let's have a look at how we can now control our apertures. So as you might have guessed already, aperture value is very, very similar to our time value mode or our shutter priority mode on our cameras. And again, we had a look at this back in lesson 2 very briefly. So it might appear as A or AV on your cameras, but again, it's the same thing. It's going to allow you to control your aperture. So your camera will then control all of the other settings to make sure that the right amount of light is coming into the camera so you're getting a good shot. So as we've just seen, depth of field allows you to blur backgrounds to emphasize a subject or to show an entire scene in focus when you want the viewer to be able to see everything. And these are another 2 creative decisions you now will be able to make when you master your apertures. Understanding apertures will give you a new creative eye for your scenes that you are looking at and allow you to shoot the scenes in 2 different ways. Now again, this is a semi-manual function, and it really is a stepping stone towards taking full control of your camera and its functions. So again, I urge you to dig into your camera's manual if you don't know where to find this on your cameras, but it should be just located on your mode selector. And again, you can start to use it straight away. You can set up a very, very simple thing for yourself at home, where you might just put objects in a row like we just saw there with the girl. And you might just try out the different apertures to see the effect in front of your face. It's really, really great thing to see if you use a shallow depth of field all the way through, maybe up to f22. You'll be able to see the difference in the depth of field happening right in front of your eyes with your photograph. So definitely urge you to try that out after this lesson. So again, depending on your camera, changing apertures may be found on the main dial or quick access dial. So again, it's completely camera dependent. You might just be able to quickly change it in the front of your camera or perhaps on the back of the camera. But I know plenty of you are using cameras like the Nikon D3300 or the Canon 1200D or the 1300D. If you are using a camera like that, it's only going to have 1 dial on it. So instead, you're going to find this little button on your camera. You should be able to find it. It might be on the top if you're using a Nikon. It might be on the back if you're using a Canon. But it'll have this little AV and plus and minus symbol on it. So you might have seen this on your camera before. If your camera has this, you will need to press this button, and this will allow you to change your aperture. So you press it in and you can then rotate the dial on the top of the camera, and that should allow you to change your shutter and your aperture. You toggle between changing your shutter and your aperture. So some cameras have this little aperture button that you press and hold, then turn the wheel to change the aperture. And that's going to be important when we get to the fully manual stage as well. Okay, so, well, that's it, guys. So that is everything that we had to cover in this particular lesson. A lot of information to take in this evening. But really, as I said, this is one of the key lessons really on the course, because shutter and apertures are fundamental to understanding fully manual, and they're fundamental to be able to control the motion in your photographs, to be able to control the depth of field in your photographs as well. And this is expanding your creative abilities by understanding apertures and your shutter speeds. You now have lots of new choices. You can now make a decision about how much motion, how much movement you want in the scene, whether you want to freeze it, whether you want it to blur. And you also have a decision now whether you want to have a shallow depth of field with a blurred background, or if you want to have a tight depth of field where everything is in focus as well. And understanding this will help you to gain more confidence in your skills and in your knowledge. And as I said before, a confident photographer is a happy photographer, and a happy photographer takes the best photographs. If you're confident, your photographs will reflect that as well. Also, we're beginning to expand our photographic vocabulary now. We're using the term f-stops. We know what shutter speeds are now as well. So congratulations, guys. You've completed lesson 4. We'll do our Q&A now in just a moment. But if you have to head off and there's any questions that you might have, just contact us at photography@shawacademy.com. And as usual, the recording of this lesson will go into your student login area as well tomorrow. So you'll be able to review this one